The horn from Delia Kramer's BMW has been blaring for 5 minutes straight. She's trapped behind $200,000 worth of steel, and the best part, it's all my doing. For the past 8 years, she's been using my property as her personal shortcut. But today, that stops. I thought I'd have peace in my retirement, but no. The moment she hit me with a ridiculous $500 HOA fine for my fence, I knew it was time to fight back. What she doesn't know yet, what I discovered in the county records is about to make her entire suburban empire come crashing down, and I've been waiting a long time to watch it burn. Retirement. It was supposed to be peaceful. That's what I told myself, at least. After 4 decades of designing municipal water systems and navigating construction codes so dense they could make your eyes bleed, I thought I'd earned some peace and quiet. I was ready for the quiet life. The kind where the hardest decision of the day was whether to sip my coffee on the front porch or the back deck of my new 15-acre property. I had it all rolling hills, a creek running through the back, and the kind of space where you couldn't even see your neighbors unless you really tried. No more meetings, no more deadlines, just me and the land. It was my dream, a sanctuary. Finally a place where I could watch deer graze without worrying about zoning ordinances or contractor delays. But that dream began to crack the day I first saw her. It was a Tuesday morning. The sun was still low and I was on the back porch enjoying my coffee watching a family of deer nibble at the wildflowers by the creek. Peaceful, right? Well, not for long. The unmistakable sound of expensive German engineering cut through the air. I turned my head just in time to see a silver BMW rolling up my gravel driveway. Out steps Delia Kramer, the kind of woman who looked like she'd been manufactured in a suburban mom factory. Perfect blonde highlight skin that looked like she spent more on skincare than I did on my entire retirement, and a smile that screamed, "I'm in charge." The outfit, yoga pants, that probably cost more than my utility bill, and a designer blazer that looked out of place in the middle of a country lane. She strode up to me with that "I'm doing you a favor" grin, and introduced herself like I should be honored. "Hi, I'm Delia Kramer, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she said as though her title meant something to me. The problem, my property isn't in Willowbrook Estates. It predates her fancy little development by at least 15 years. But she wasn't about to let that little detail stop her. "I just wanted to stop by and chat about your fence," she said, pointing to the simple chain-link fence I'd put up around my vegetable garden. "You know, to keep the deer from turning my tomatoes into an all-you-can-eat buffet." She was cordial enough, but there was something in her tone, something smug, like she had the power to tell me what to do. And she did, at least in her mind. "That fence," she said, glancing at it with the air of someone who was completely disgusted by the sight of anything that wasn't a perfect suburban standard, "isn't in compliance with community guidelines." I blinked. "Community guidelines?" I asked, a little confused. "That's right," she said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "HOA rules require all fences to be white vinyl, a minimum of 6 feet tall, and they must have decorative post caps. It's all right here in our bylaws." She waved her clipboard in front of me like she was reading from the Bible itself. Now let me clarify something here. I've been a civil engineer my entire life. I know property law, I know building codes, I know when someone's trying to pull a fast one, and this was definitely a fast one. I was just about to point out that her HOA had zero jurisdiction over my land when she kept talking. Apparently my 4-foot galvanized steel fence was affecting property values, she claimed. It was dragging the entire neighborhood down. I didn't even know how to respond to that. My 15 acres were completely independent of Willowbrook Estates. But I was still polite, trying to keep things civil, and like a fool, I told her I'd look into it instead of simply telling her to get off my property. 2 weeks later, I received a violation notice in the mail, and I could practically feel her smug smile through the envelope. $500 fine. For a fence. And if I didn't comply within 30 days, another $50 every day. I ignored it. I called the number on the letterhead to explain that my land wasn't part of her precious HOA, that I was outside of her jurisdiction. The voice on the other end was hers. "Oh, you must be confused," she said, her tone dripping with that same condescending charm. "Every property in the area falls under our HOA jurisdiction. But don't worry, I'll come by with a surveyor to clear up any confusion." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was about to go head-to-head with someone who thought they could dictate my life based on some flimsy HOA rules. But Delia had no idea who she was dealing with. I might have been retired, but I'd been waiting for someone like her to come along. Someone who would push me just a little too far. And when that happens, well, that's when I start fighting back. The next morning, Delia showed up at my house again, this time with a surveyor in tow. I could already tell this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. The man with her looked uncomfortable, glancing at me as though I might suddenly explode, and I wasn't far from it. They spent hours on my property, measuring the fence, consulting their maps, and talking in whispers like they were in some secret club. I stayed inside, arms crossed, watching through the window. I knew what was coming. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. Delia had her sights set on something much bigger. When they finally made their way back to my porch, Delia was practically beaming. "Mr. Thompson," she said with a saccharine smile, "I have some good news. After working with our surveyor, it turns out that while your house is outside of Willowbrook Estates' jurisdiction, the fence you've put up is actually sitting on property that falls under our HOA's control." I stared at her, completely floored. "What are you talking about? I'm saying that your fence is on property that belongs to Willowbrook Estates," she explained with a touch of exasperation, as if I should have known this already. "Our surveyor's findings show your eastern property line is inside our boundary." I tried to process what she was saying, but it made no sense. "My property predates Willowbrook Estates by at least 15 years. That's impossible. My land was here long before your subdivision was even a thought." She shrugged like it was no big deal. "Well, according to the survey, that's not the case. Your fence is infringing on our jurisdiction, and you need to take it down." At that moment, I felt like I was losing control. I had spent my whole career making sure things were done by the book, and now here she was trying to steamroll me with nothing but a clipboard and a vague survey. I knew this wasn't going to be resolved easily. "I'm going to need to see the survey," I said, my voice even but firm. I wasn't about to take her word for it. "Well, it's not quite finalized," she said, her smile faltering for a moment. "But we're confident in its accuracy." I wasn't buying it. If it's not finalized, then it's not official. And you have no grounds to tell me what to do with my property. She didn't seem fazed. "I'm sure you'll see it soon enough," she said. "But you need to understand something, Mr. Thompson. We've been accommodating, but this situation has gone on long enough. We're giving you until the end of the month to remove that fence." I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I kept it together. "If you really believe this is your property, show me the documentation. I'm not just going to take your word for it." Her face tightened. "I'll make sure you get the documents." With that, she turned to leave, but not before throwing one last condescending remark over her shoulder. "We'll be in touch." I watched them both drive off, the nerve of her still rattling around in my head. There was no way I was just going to take down my fence and let her push me around. Not without a fight. The next morning, I went straight to the county records office. I wasn't going to rely on her lies. I was going to dig through the property records myself and find out what was really going on. I'd been an engineer my entire life, and I knew how to find the truth when it was buried deep in a pile of paperwork. The clerk at the office gave me a skeptical look when I requested records dating back to the 1,980 seconds, but she didn't question me. I spent the entire day combing through stacks of documents looking for anything that would back up Delia's claim. And by the end of the day, I had my answer. The first thing I uncovered was my own deed from 1,987. The property boundaries were clearly marked, and there was no mention of any easements or HOA jurisdiction. My land was free and clear, but then I kept digging. And that's when I found it, the golden ticket that would change everything. Buried in the records for Willowbrook Estates, I found a document from 2002, long after my property had been purchased, that outlined a temporary construction easement. The easement allowed Willowbrook to use a portion of my property for Phase 2 of their development. But here's the kicker: it expired in December 2004. It had been dead for over 15 years, and Delia and her crew had been driving through my land every day committing criminal trespassing without a second thought. And it didn't stop there. As I dug deeper, I found something even juicier. The language in the Willowbrook HOA's charter made it crystal clear that any violation of easement agreements could result in the immediate removal of board members. That meant Delia had been breaking her own HOA's rules every time she drove through my property. I had everything I needed to take her down, but I wasn't going to confront her just yet. I wanted to be sure. I needed to make my move carefully. And that's when I stumbled upon something else, an undeveloped 50-acre plot of land for sale right next to my property. I was looking at a perfect opportunity. If I bought it, I could control the very access route Delia had been using. It was a $200,000 gamble, but I didn't care. I was tired of being pushed around by an entitled HOA president, and this land would give me the leverage I needed. I made the call that afternoon. I bought the land, and I was ready to make my move. The morning I closed on the 50 acres was a turning point. That afternoon I wasted no time. Contractors were already on the property building what I like to call my retirement project. But it wasn't just any fence, it was a fortress. 8-foot chain, link topped with barbed wire, the kind that made a statement. Security cameras were installed at every corner and motion sensors were buried deep. It wasn't just about keeping Delia out, it was about making sure she knew exactly who was in charge now. The following day, I stood by the newly erected gate watching the final touches. The tension in the air was palpable. Delia had no idea what she was walking into. Around midday, I saw it the familiar silver BMW. I couldn't help but smile. She had no clue that she was about to hit a wall literally and figuratively. She pulled up her usual arrogance intact. Stepping out of the car, she was dressed in the same self-important, polished look, expensive heels, designer blazer like she was headed to a board meeting, not standing in front of my new fortress. "Morning, Delia," I said, keeping my tone light. "Can I help you with something?" She didn't even acknowledge my greeting, her eyes scanning the new gate, then looking at me with the familiar smugness. "I'm here to discuss the access road," she began, all business, like she had any right to dictate anything on my land. "You can't block a community access route like this. It's illegal." I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Community access. This is private property, Delia, and you've been trespassing on it for years. The easement you've been using expired in 2004. So no, you don't have any rights to it anymore." Her face froze, her eyes narrowing as she tried to process what I was saying. "What are you talking about? This is Willowbrook Estates access. You can't just shut it down." I smiled, feeling the weight of everything I'd uncovered settling in. "Actually, I can. Because as of yesterday, I own the land that controls all your access points. Every shortcut you've been using for years. It's mine now, and you're never going to use it again." She froze the words clearly, not sinking in at first. Then her mouth opened, but she had nothing to say. "You can't do this," she finally stammered. "You're destroying the community." I crossed my arms, taking in the scene. "No, Delia, I'm saving the community. You've used your position for years to push people around to bully them into complying with your standards, all while violating property laws. That stops now." Her face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. The entitlement she'd been riding on for so long was now crumbling. I wasn't some easy target. I wasn't the pushover she assumed I was when she first showed up at my door. I pulled out the stack of documents I'd spent hours digging through: the county records, the easement, the Willowbrook HOA charter, and handed them to her. She hesitated, then took them, scanning through the pages. "You can't possibly think this is going to hold up," she said, her voice dripping with nervousness. "I'll sue you for this. You'll regret it." I shook my head. "You've already crossed the line, Delia. The paperwork's clear. You've been trespassing for years. And now I've got all the evidence I need to make sure you never do it again. Your reign is over." Her shoulders slumped slightly, her earlier bravado slipping. "This is a mistake. You'll see," she muttered, turning to her surveyor, who had been standing silently in the background, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. But it was too late for her. She had no idea how deep I had dug, how much I had prepared. The community she had manipulated for years was about to see the truth, and so was she. I smiled again, watching her retreat to her car. She wasn't going to be a problem anymore. Not with this evidence, not with the power I held now. As her BMW disappeared down the road, I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This was it. The fight was far from over, but I had her cornered now. She had no more shortcuts, no more power. And the best part, she had no idea just how much was about to come crashing down on her. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal meetings, phone calls, and paperwork, but the truth was I was enjoying every second of it. Delia Kramer, once the untouchable queen of Willowbrook Estates, was about to learn what it meant to be held accountable for her actions. It didn't take long for the HOA board to feel the heat. Once they realized that the power Delia had wielded for so long was now unraveling, they started scrambling. Meanwhile, I was sitting back, letting the pieces fall into place. One morning, I got a call from the county planning office. They'd reviewed the documents I'd submitted, and they were ready to discuss the violations Delia had been committing both on my property and in the wider neighborhood. They had the evidence, but they needed to hear my side. I walked into that meeting with confidence, armed with a stack of county records, surveys, and documents, showing just how deep Delia's corruption went. I could see the wheels turning in the county officials' heads as they realized that they were dealing with a much bigger problem than a simple fence dispute. But it wasn't just the county that got involved. As the investigation gained steam, I started hearing from other Willowbrook residents. Some of them had been too scared to speak up while Delia was in charge, but now, with the truth out there, they were coming forward in droves. Complaints about vote manipulation, selective enforcement of rules, and financial mismanagement were flooding in. It turned out Delia's reign wasn't just about enforcing community guidelines, it was about lining her pockets and silencing anyone who stood in her way. That was when the state stepped in. An official investigation was launched into the Willowbrook HOA's practices. Delia's illegal use of the easement, the shady deals she had orchestrated with contractors, and the thousands of dollars in fines she had imposed on residents, all of it was about to come to light. The best part, it was all happening under the public eye. Local news stations picked up on the story, and soon Delea was the face of HOA corruption. The irony was not lost on me. She had spent years turning everyone into her personal puppets, and now she was the one being strung up in the spotlight. I watched as the news reported on her downfall, the investigation into her embezzlement fraud and racketeering. The authorities were closing in. It was only a matter of time before she was arrested. And then came the letter. The HOA board had voted unanimously to suspend all actions related to the association's authority. They had no choice. The state had taken over, and Delea was no longer in charge. Every fine she had ever imposed was invalid, including the ridiculous $500 violation for my fence. It was a strange feeling seeing it all come to an end. I had spent months, even years, dealing with Delea's overreach and manipulation. But now it was over. The community she had terrorized for so long was finally free. And it didn't stop there. As I stood in front of the property one morning watching a group of kids from the local school on a field trip exploring the wildlife preserve I'd helped establish on my land, I realized how much had changed. The community that had once been fractured by fear and control was now coming together. People were planting gardens, learning about sustainability and building relationships, things that Delea had tried to suppress for years. But the best part was knowing that my land, the place she had taken for granted, was now a thriving hub for everyone to enjoy. The 50 acres I had purchased weren't just about revenge. They had become a symbol of what happens when you stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. A few months later, Delea was arrested. The charges were serious: felony embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. She had used her position to funnel money from the HOA for personal gain, and now the law was catching up to her. She was facing prison time, and it was clear her political career and her HOA presidency were over. As the community settled into a new rhythm free from her influence, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Sometimes standing up for what's right means putting everything on the line. Sometimes you have to be willing to spend what others would consider a ridiculous amount of money to make a point. But in the end, it was worth it. Because in the end, it wasn't about the fence. It wasn't even about Delea anymore. It was about protecting my rights, protecting the community, and making sure that no one could ever abuse their power like she had again. And as for Delea, she moved to Florida trying to outrun her past. But the truth had already caught up with her. The lessons of this battle weren't lost on the new HOA board members. They were working to ensure that something like this could never happen again, implementing transparent processes and fair rules for everyone. And me, well, I had my peace, I had my land, and I had justice.